It's August 2007. The iPhone has just been released. Facebook is starting to expand beyond college campuses. And a graduate student at Caltech named Virgil Griffith has just created something that's about to cause a lot of people in Washington some very uncomfortable moments. Griffith called it Wikiscanner. The concept was deceptively simple. You see, Wikipedia logs the IP addresses of anonymous users who make edits. That information is buried deep in the site's records, but it's technically public. What Griffith did was create a searchable database that cross-referenced those IP addresses with known organizations. Now, by 2007, Wikipedia had already become one of the most visited websites in the world. It was the encyclopedia of the internet age. Teachers were telling students not to cite it in papers, but everyone was using it anyway. It had become, for better or worse, a primary source of information for millions of people. And Griffith's little tool revealed something interesting about who was editing that information. Computers belonging to the FBI had been making anonymous edits to Wikipedia, so had computers from the CIA. They weren't just fixing typos or correcting minor factual errors. FBI computers had removed satellite imagery from the article about the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. CIA computers edited articles about the Iraq War, including manipulating a graphic that displayed casualty figures. They had also edited the biography of former CIA director William Colby, expanding the list of his accomplishments. Now, you could argue that anyone can edit Wikipedia. That's the entire point of the site. Some random FBI employee could have been doing this on their lunch break, editing articles about topics they happen to know about. But this wasn't one or two edits. This was a pattern. Multiple edits from government agency computers on topics directly related to those agencies and their operations. Wikipedia co-founder Jimmy Wales actually praised Wikiscanner when it came out. He said it provided an additional level of transparency about what's going on in Wikipedia. And yet, here they were, quietly editing how they're portrayed on one of the most visited websites in the world, and scrubbing imagery they didn't want the public to see. The Wikiscanner story made headlines for a few days, then faded into the background noise of the internet. Because editing Wikipedia articles is probably the least disturbing thing the FBI has been caught doing.
The FBI may have helped put hundreds of potentially innocent people behind bars, or even worse, help put potentially innocent people to death.
The FBI is notifying hundreds of convicts nationwide. Some of the defendants won't get the notice. They've already been executed.
In 2015, the FBI made an announcement that should have been front-page news everywhere. The announcement revealed that for more than 2 decades, FBI forensic experts had been giving false testimony in criminal trials across America. 26 of 28 FBI agents and their microscopic hair comparison unit had overstated forensic matches in ways that favored prosecutors in more than 95% of 268 trials reviewed. Let me break down what that actually means. For decades, starting in the 1970s, FBI agents would testify in courtrooms that a hair found at a crime scene matched a defendant. They would present this as a scientific fact, and juries would believe them. Of course they would, but there was no scientific basis for any of those statistics. Hair analysis simply couldn't do what they claimed it could. There was no research showing how often hairs from different people might look the same under a microscope, and this wasn't one rogue examiner going off script. 26 of 28 examiners were doing it. It was systemic, and it was taught. The FBI ran training courses for 25 years that reached hundreds of state and local hair examiners throughout the country. They taught them the same flawed language, the same unfounded certainty, the same made-up statistics. One of the cases that helped expose this was Santee Tribbles. In 1978, Washington DC was a very different city than it is today. Crime rates were rising. The crack epidemic was still a few years away, but the city was already struggling. And on one summer night, a taxi driver named John McCormick was murdered during a robbery. The killer wore a stocking mask. Santee was 17 years old. He was arrested and charged with the murder based largely on the testimony of an FBI hair analyst who told the jury that a hair from the stocking mask microscopically matched Santee's hair. The analyst said there was 1 chance in 10 million that the hair could belong to someone else. Santee maintained his innocence. But what chance did a 17-year-old kid from DC have against an FBI expert in a lab coat citing statistics? He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life. He never stopped insisting he was innocent for 28 years. Finally, in 2012, DNA testing was conducted on the 13 hairs recovered from that stocking mask. None of them belonged to Sante. And here's the detail that really stays with me. One of those hairs, the one the FBI expert had confidentially testified, matched Tribble with odds of 10 million to 1, wasn't even human. It came from a dog. An FBI expert had stood in a courtroom, sworn on oath to tell the truth, and testified with scientific certainty that a dog hair matched a human being. Sante was exonerated. The city of Washington, D.C. was ordered to pay him $13.2 million. Sante spent 28 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He lived only 8 years as a free man before dying in June 2020. He was 59 years old. He spent more years in a prison cell than he ever spent free. And Tribble wasn't alone. The FBI's review eventually covered about 3,000 cases. 32 defendants had been sentenced to death based at least in part on this testimony. Of those, 14 had already been executed or died in prison by the time the review was conducted. People were put to death based on testimony the FBI now admits was scientifically meaningless. However, the bad thing about these wrongful convictions wasn't just how they destroyed the lives of innocent people. It meant that the guilty went free. In March 1965, a small-time thug named Teddy Deegan was murdered in a Chelsea, Massachusetts alley. It was a gangland killing, the kind that happened fairly regular in Boston's underworld during that era. The city was in the middle of a mob war, with different factions fighting for control of the rackets. Within days of Deegan's murder, FBI agents in Boston knew exactly who had done it. They wrote memos to J. Edgar Hoover himself, naming the actual killer. This wasn't speculation. They had informants. They had intelligence. So they knew. But two of the actual murderers happened to be FBI informants. And protecting those informants was more important to the borough than justice for Teddy Deegan or anyone else. So those memos stayed buried. Instead, the FBI allowed a mob hit named Joseph Barboza to testify against 4 other men. Peter Lemone, Joseph Salvati, Henry Temaleo, and Louis Greco. Barboza had grudges against some of them. Salvati, for instance, owed him $300. That was enough for Barboza to put an innocent man in a murder case. The FBI knew Barboza was lying. They had documentation proving it. They had memos in their own files showing who the real killers were. However, they said nothing. All 4 men were convicted. 2 of them, Lemone and Temaleo, were sentenced to death. The death sentences were later commuted to life in prison when Massachusetts briefly abolished capital punishment, but the men stayed locked up. They would spend decades behind bars for a crime the FBI knew they didn't commit. Henry Temaleo died in prison in 1985. He was 84 years old, the oldest prisoner in the Massachusetts state system at the time. He had spent 17 years incarcerated for a murder he had nothing to do with. Louis Greco died in prison in 1995 after 27 years of incarceration. His health had deteriorated steadily over the decades. 2 years after his death, his son Louis Jr. committed suicide by drinking Drano. Joseph Salvati served 30 years before his sentence was finally commuted in 1997. So the whole time the FBI didn't just stay silent. They actively worked to keep the innocent man in prison. When Lemone and Greco applied for pardons, the FBI funneled false information to the governor's office. Both applications were denied. When Salvati's case came up for review in 1986, the FBI provided false information to ensure his communication was blocked. They weren't just covering up a mistake. They were actively working, year after year, decade after decade, to ensure that innocent men stayed in prison. The truth only came out in 2000 during a Justice Department investigation into FBI corruption in Boston. The investigation had originally been focused on the bureau's relationship with Whitey Bulger, but it uncovered something much larger. Secret files revealed what the FBI had known all along. 4 men had been framed. The FBI had the evidence to prove their innocence from the very beginning, and they had buried it. In 2007, a federal judge ordered the government to pay $101.7 million in damages to the surviving men and the families of those who had died. Judge Nancy Gertner called the government's defense absurd and wrote that the FBI's misconduct was clearly the sole cause of this conviction. The families of Temaleo and Greco received settlements, but Temaleo and Greco were already dead.
Man, oh man, there has been...
handled Barbosa, H. Paul Rico, was questioned by a congressional committee about the case years later. He was asked if he had any remorse for what happened to the innocent man. "What do you want from me?" Rico replied, "Tears?" Robert Hansen joined the FBI in 1976. He was by all accounts a good agent, methodical, careful, intelligent. He rose through the ranks over the years, eventually working in senior counterintelligence positions. His job, quite literally, was to catch spies. And for 22 years, from 1979 to 2001, he was one himself. The Cold War was supposed to be winding down when Hansen started selling secrets to the Soviet Union. It was 1979. The Berlin Wall wouldn't fall for another decade. The immediate threat of nuclear annihilation had receded somewhat from the public consciousness. But the intelligence war never stopped, and Hansen had access to some of the most sensitive information in the American government. Started small, as these things often do. He would deliver packages to dead drops, locations where he could leave documents without ever meeting his handlers face to face. He used the codename Ramon Garcia. He was extremely careful, constantly checking FBI files to make sure no investigation was getting close to him. And over the years, he sold everything. He sold the identities of Soviet officials who were secretly working for the United States. Some of those people were executed after Hansen exposed them. He sold details about American nuclear operations. He sold counterintelligence techniques, essentially giving the Russians a manual on how to evade the very systems designed to catch them. He sold the existence of a secret tunnel the FBI had built under the Soviet embassy in Washington for eavesdropping, a project that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Over the course of his career as a double agent, he received more than $1.4 million in cash, bank funds, and diamonds from his Russian handlers. In 1987, something almost darkly comedic happened. The FBI became aware that there was a mole somewhere in the American intelligence community. Someone was leaking information. They needed to find out who, so they brought Robert Hansen in to help with the investigation. The spy was hunting for himself. Hansen steered the investigation away from his own activities. He pointed fingers in other directions. He used his position on the mole hunting team to ensure that the trial never led back to him. The investigation was eventually closed without any arrests. He donated some of his spy earnings to charity, as if that would balance the scales. And then, in 1985, he started spying again. He wasn't finally caught until 2001. The FBI had to pay $7 million to a former KGB officer, who provided documents that helped identify Hansen as the traitor. On February 18th of that year, agents arrested him at a park in Vienna, Virginia, right after he'd placed a garbage bag full of classified documents at a dead drop for his Russian handler.
February 18th of last year, and the man in this grainy video is FBI agent Robert Hansen. He has just dropped off a batch of stolen U.S. documents for Russian agents and is on his way now to pick up their $50,000 payoff. What he doesn't know is that he's being watched by dozens of his fellow FBI agents. For a split second, Hansen is alone in the picture, but clearly sees what's approaching. Then they're on him. Machine guns are trained on his chest as agents begin to handcuff him. One agent shoves Hansen while others grasp his arms. Another agent seizes what appears to be Hansen's FBI badge and throws it to the ground. They spread his legs and seem to be barking orders. Hansen is finally marched away. The look on his face is unreadable.
He was 56 years old. He had been spying for more than 2 decades. The entire time, he had been going to work at the FBI, attending meetings about counterintelligence, helping hunt for moles, collecting his government salary, and selling his country's secrets. Hansen was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He died in June 2023. Speaking of protecting sensitive information, let me tell you about what happened in January 2023. A 23-year-old hacker from Switzerland was bored one evening. She was browsing Shodan, which is basically a search engine that lets cybersecurity researchers find servers exposed to the open internet. It's a tool used by professionals to locate vulnerabilities before bad actors do. Or at least, that's the idea. The hacker, who goes by Maya Arson online, was clicking through dozens of exposed servers, looking for something interesting. Most were boring, routine corporate stuff, nothing worth investigating further. Then she found something different. An exposed Jenkins server belonging to Commute Air a small regional airline based in Ohio that operates flights for United Airlines. The server was sitting there, completely unsecured, connected directly to the public internet. The default password had never been changed. Within minutes, she was inside the entire system. She found credentials for more than 40 Amazon cloud storage buckets. She found access to databases. She found personal information on nearly 1,000 Commute Air employees. And then she found 2 files that made her stop. One was named nofly.csv. The other was named selectee.csv. It was the TSA's no-fly list. The entire thing. Just sitting there on an unsecured server, available to anyone who knew where to look. The no-fly list is maintained by the FBI's Terrorist Screening Center. It's the database of known or suspected terrorists who are banned from boarding any aircraft flying to, from, or within the United States. It's one of the most sensitive documents in American national security. It was created after the September 11th attacks, specifically to prevent terrorists from getting on planes. And a bored hacker found it because a regional airline left it on a server with a default password. The list contained over 1.5 million entries, names, dates of birth, aliases. The selectee file contained another 251,000 entries of people who get flagged for additional security screening every time they fly. On the list was Viktor Bout, the Russian's arms dealer known as the Merchant of Death, along with 16 of his known aliases. He'd been in the news recently because the Biden administration had just traded him back to Russia in exchange for WNBA star Brittany Griner. There were suspected members of the IRA. There were names from every corner of the global terrorism landscape. And there were also, according to the hacker, children. She noted that one entry's date of birth would have made the person 8 years old. The hacker claimed that based on her access to Commute Air systems, she could have likely done more than just steal data. She told the Washington Times that she probably could have cancelled or delayed flights. She could have potentially created physical credentials for airline employees. Commute Air said they couldn't validate all of her claims, but they also couldn't definitely say she was wrong. The TSA opened an investigation. Commute Air took the server offline. They issued statements about how the list was an outdated 2019 version that was only being used for testing purposes. But by then, the damage was done. The list ended up being shared on a publicly accessible hacking forum. The identities of hundreds of thousands of people on a secret government watchlist were now available to anyone who wanted them. Maya Arson had been indicted by a US grand jury back in 2021 for allegedly being part of a conspiracy that hacked dozens of companies and government organizations. She was already a known figure in the cybersecurity world. She was operating openly under her real identity from Switzerland, posting about her discoveries on a personal blog with an anarchist aesthetic. And she still managed to completely own a critical piece of American transportation infrastructure in less than a day. In her own words, with pretty much no skill required besides the patience to look through hundreds of results. The whole incident came just weeks after the FAA's notice to air mission system went down, grounding all US air travel for the first time since September 11th, 2001. That outage was caused by contract workers accidentally deleting computer files. 2 major disruptions to American aviation in the span of a few weeks. One caused by human error, one caused by a forgotten password. It's March 8th, 2023. FBI Director Christopher Wray is sitting before the Senate Intelligence Committee. It's one of those typical government oversight hearings, the kind that usually drone on for hours without producing much of anything newsworthy. Senators ask questions. Agency heads give careful, lawyerly answers. Everyone goes home. But then Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon asks a simple question. Does the FBI purchase US phone geolocation information? Wray pauses. And then he admits something that privacy advocates had been warning about for years. To my knowledge, we do not currently purchase commercial database information that includes location data derived from internet advertising. I understand that we previously, as in the past, purchased some such information for a specific national security pilot project. And just like that, it was confirmed. The FBI had been buying people's location data, not requesting it through official channels, not getting a warrant. Just purchasing it from commercial data brokers who collect this information from apps on your phone. Back in 2018, the Supreme Court had ruled in Carpenter vs. United States that government agencies accessing location data without a warrant was a violation of the Fourth Amendment. That's the one that protects you against unreasonable searches and seizures. The founders wrote it because they were concerned about government overreach. They wanted to ensure that the state couldn't just rummage through your life without good reason and judicial oversight. But there was a loophole in the ruling. It was narrow. And apparently, if you just buy the data instead of directly collecting it, those constitutional protections don't seem to apply. Or at least, that's what the FBI's lawyers concluded. Ray said the practice had ended. He said the FBI had no plans to change that, and now uses a court-authorized process instead. But think about what that administration actually means. For years, federal agents could track where you went, who you met with, when you were home and when you weren't. All without ever having to convince a judge that there was probable cause. This wasn't some shadowy leak from a whistleblower. This was the director of the FBI admitting this openly, on camera in a Senate hearing. Which means they knew this information was going to come out. They prepared for it. They had their lawyers review their statements. And their response was basically, yeah, we did that, but we stopped. This was probably just the tip of the iceberg, the information they were willing to release. So you don't even want to imagine what type of classified information there is. These are just the cases that came out. The ones that made it into court records or got exposed through Freedom of Information Act requests or leaked during congressional investigations. How many more are still buried in classified files somewhere?